all, we continue to applaud the Obama summit, the US-Africa summit. We think that it's very positive about the private sector announcements, that multi-billion-dollar transactions over the next decade or so. But where we feel we could add some value to that process is there was a lot of speak around foreign direct investment. And our main focus is principally institutional investment. How can we work with African pension funds, African sovereign wealth funds, and how can the African pension and sovereign wealth fund investment community co-invest and encourage and catalyze international pension funds and international sovereign wealth funds to invest in Africa with them? And importantly, how can the international allocations from African pension and sovereign wealth funds co-invest in the home markets of our international investors? And we think that's a good strategy to continue to build trust and the sort of bilateral relationship rather than Africa being just a recipient. So that's what New York Stock Exchange Summit achieved. And then we took this message to the Africa Investor Heads of State Investment Advisory Council to continue to encourage our heads of state partners to create a more liberalized, transparent, open environment for pension funds to be able to invest in critical asset classes, infrastructure in particular, capital markets as another example, and that's what we did in New York. So we announced at that time a $1 billion Africa investor sovereign investment platform, which is essentially going to be crowding in African capital. Because you see, one of the key things that we talk about a lot is intra-African trade. And it's currently at about 12 to 15%, depending on whose statistics you look at. We're called Africa Investor, we're focused on investment. When you look at intra-African investment, it is only 5%. So we think that there's a real job that needs to be done. We think it's a niche area to really promote and stimulate intra-African investment. If you look at the OECD figures, for example, for intra-European investment, they're currently at about 82%. So we believe, and we are very focused on stimulating with our own capital and with our co-investment institutional partners from the continent to boost the intra-African investment figures over the next 10 years. In terms of the issue of local content, we believe in beneficiation, and we think there's great opportunities for all partners, whether they're international technical partners, whether they're local private sector partners, whether they're local consumers. I think the key thing is how can you do it in a transparent way which grows the local private sector. So we really want to see African resources being developed and leveraged so that they can create, as we heard here today, small and medium-sized companies that one day have the potential to list on the capital markets. So we really want to see a pipeline established, and it's not one size necessarily fits all, but we've really got to start inculcating more of a venture capital culture on the continent. Right now we talk about venture capital, but the real activity is only in the private equity larger transactions. I think our view is let's help the smaller companies up the J-curve, and let's work with them so that they've got the right disciplines, the right systems in place, the right international partners, the right local partners, and then of course a hospitable and conducive regulatory framework that fosters growth. We need to start rewarding people that take risks in the continent, and we need to really get behind the pioneers on the continent, and we know it can happen. We've seen Dangote, we've seen MTN, we've heard about Helios Towers here, the list goes on. First of all, we need to strengthen our capacity to enforce not just illicit flows, but all undesirable practices that are going to harm the reputation of the continent as a potential recipient and destination for both domestic and international capital. But I think that the governments on the continent have come a long way, and we see them as a very strong partner. We also, which is why we're here, both with our partners in government, with our institutional investors, our private sector partners, and the World Bank, and because we see it as an ecosystem, and we think that too much territoriality of we're civil society, we're government, we're development finance institutions, we're the bank, you're the private sector. We don't see that. We see a pipeline, an ecosystem that can achieve at the end everything that each segmented group wants to achieve, but it's not connected. So we see ourselves very much as the glue and the connector. Yes.
cross-border banking is extremely important, it's useful, especially it will work to get the private sector growing. The private sector is the engine of growth. However, he also hammers stability, the fact that there should be proper regulation for confidence building because of what banks basically do. They are deposit takers.
Now, the private sector, in our case, would mean the SMEs, potential entrepreneurs trying to venture into business. And these are important in driving our economies. Now, the cross-border banks bring in experience from where they're coming to where they're setting up businesses. And for us, our vision is to provide a globally accepted best practice in the regulation and supervision of cross-border banking, which would enable growth of the sector without threatening financial sector stability. We think that that then will be key to the confidence for the private sector to partner in whatever form to support cross-border banking.
Thankfully, a bank in 18 other African countries. So, I think the context of my comments is exactly that, in the sense that we, as an institution, are represented in 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore the need to understand the complexities of what's described as cross-border banking, which shouldn't be confused with trade or anything else, or transferability of money. It's defined around a multi-jurisdictional bank, and therefore brings to bear the concept that people raised earlier of the governors around this home and host environment. And when I asked the question, you know, what are some of my wishes? Well, the reality is that every single one of the 20 countries we operate in has a different regulatory environment.
What can and should large financiers be doing to help well-managed, promising companies move from small or medium companies to larger ones? Given the likelihood of expanding companies to look to neighboring markets, what can we do to get African companies with big growth plans to move into and manage the risks associated with expansion into the poorest and most fragile neighboring states?
How the private sector can support inclusive growth by addressing the value chain. And the main actor of the value chain are SME and other companies. And these companies and the SMEs are across the border of formal and the real economy. We try to bring them back to the real economy. That's one. And there are other companies that we try to bring to be anchored enterprises, enterprises that will be active in the value chain by supporting large investment projects. And this means what does that mean? That means that we finance large projects like port, transport, rail, and things like that. But it doesn't bring a really growth. Our experience is that doesn't help so much. Also, we have tried in the past, like all multilateral, to do direct financing of SME through line of credits. That also did not bring too much effectiveness and bring value to the chain of growth. Because most of us, we are doing it from line of credit to good banks, and then we don't want to take the risk in our portfolio for rating and other consideration. So we tried this initiative that consists of two components. The first component to address the funding, and the second component to address diversification of product, the market going cross-border and regional for some of the companies that we identify as potential growth anchor.
the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. I'm the CEO of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. I think the first observation that we had when we started was obviously the challenge of equity and having ample equity to grow these businesses, and that is something that I see as a challenge for most of the small and medium-scale enterprises that we have come across. The second thing is obviously what Jean-Philippe mentioned earlier, which is the cost and duration of debt, which remains an ongoing problem. I'm sure we all know this. Our experience, and we made an investment, I think recently, we announced a commitment of $100 million in debt to a local gas processing and transportation company, which we will make that transition into something fairly large over time within Nigeria, while helping solve basic infrastructure issues like power.
I'd like to tell us the story of a few companies which have made it, and during that story, I wanted to think about the classic SME rhetoric. We often confuse venture capital with SME development, and we forget the development that we need, the examples of winning businesses in all markets. Why has South Africa got 88 of the biggest? Because there are examples around clustering benefits. Standards are set. When there are some winners, and you've seen it in Nigeria of late as businesses have come through and scaled up. And I think the Dangote Group is one great example, which gives ambition to a region, which gives ambition to a place, and other businesses to grow. So I would suggest, in the World Bank Group and IFC point of view, you are big, and you're big ticket players, and I think it's time we develop the big ticket as well, and not just the politically popular small, because you need them actually to spawn and support the small. What would Korea have been without the Kai ball? The Korean government's trying to beat up the Kai ball for the last 15 years, if you read the local press. Samsung just keeps growing. But look at all those other businesses and the skills and the clustering stuff that's created. If you go and look at the work Ricardo Hausman does at Harvard, it's all about skills development in the economy, and see that clustering is incredibly powerful. So that's the first point. Second point is...
So we decided to develop a company that develops projects and takes the risk up front to be able to do the studies, to actually make the projects fundable. Because in the infrastructure class, you appreciate that it's always been seen as unfundable or very difficult to put together any kind of structure. And so we work in these three sectors, and we build ports, we build roads, we build railways, energy projects. We are in gold and copper and iron ore, in tin and coal. We grow bananas, tomatoes, and macadamia nuts, and we're also in cement. And the thing that we are finding is there are many projects, but not all projects are bankable. And so our job becomes, how do you choose the best projects to be able to make bankable, number one. Number two, how do you work with governments that really do want to develop? One of the things that we were very surprised about is it takes so long to be able to get projects to close. And one assumes that in countries where there's such an opportunity for development, governments would welcome people like us with open arms and really ensure that those lead times are short. Well, this is not a fact. So we have come to understand that also as African governments, we're probably the only businesses, we're based in South Africa but operate throughout the continent. We're the only private businesses that don't have our governments come with us when we want to invest across our own continent. So when we come to Tanzania or to Ghana or to Angola, we find the Germans, and the German government is there with their German banks. We find the Chinese are there with their Chinese banks, supporting those companies, ensuring that those companies are successful. We're on our own, and yet we're trying to stimulate businesses that are African. Our banks, we are the third in line when we're looking for funding, and yet with these other countries, their banks are talking to the politicians. Now, I've spoken to a few presidents in the continent to try and find out what the problem is, and their biggest position is they're quite concerned that when they come with their companies, it's always seen as corruption in its African businesses, and it's never seen as actually promoting businesses in Africa. But it's a challenge because if we are going to grow companies that operate across the continent, there has to be participation from Africans. To be able to ensure that business is sustainable, there has to be involvement of Africans and of women.
Africa is now in a position where we are telling our own stories and we also want to consume our own stories, which is a very, very, very important evolution to the space. There are, of course, many advantages of the media and entertainment space in Africa. It is one where understanding a large proportion of the young people that make up a large proportion of the continent are very attracted to the sector. It's definitely a place where you can create a lot of jobs. It does foster education and more importantly, provides a great platform for changing perceptions globally about our continent. Yes, we do have a young continent. The time for, again, looking at the sector in much more serious ways is now better than ever before. Based on more macroeconomic forces such as more stable governments, regulation and privatization of this sector is really spurring a lot of growth. At the same time, it does provide opportunities like our company and Viacom. As Viacom, I represent a whole bunch of brands that we've launched into Africa. We started, of course, with our MTV brand as a case study. We looked at Africa. The investment idea was not to approach Africa in the way that we approached launching an MTV channel, for instance, in Europe, where you put a channel together and you get the content. For us, we have to look at it differently. How do we foster how do we actually help to create the content from that perspective? How do we actually form part of the supply chain for the content that we need to place on our channel? So we have to do a lot of development, build capacity. We have to train people, we have to train young people, the producers, the directors, the musicians, on how to create better content. Of course, it helped us create a unique proposition for our brand, but more importantly, it helped to actually elevate the creative landscape on that front, which has been very, very powerful in what you see today. In the music front, for instance, African music is traveling not only across Africa, but obviously into the other parts of the world now. A quick anecdote, a friend of mine whose daughter is going to school and went to a party at MIT was there and saying that they're listening to African music at MIT.
Grateful to you all, African investor. It's an absolute honor, and I think that it's auspicious that as you've been here today as investors talking about this, we were also talking about all of you at some of the meetings we had today on Ebola, on financing for development. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to, first of all, say that one of the things we are concerned about with regard to our private sector and what is happening now on the continent is twofold. One is that we feel very strongly that African private sector and all those interested in investing or who are already investing in Africa should be active participants in this fight against Ebola. It was because our private sector in Nigeria acted, they made donations, they helped us with logistics. And I shared this at the international conference this morning with UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon and the World Bank President. I think that the private sector came in as one with the government, that was one of the reasons we succeeded. And so I urge the international community not just to look at governments and multilateral organizations, but to also call on the private sector to assist. The second point regarding the private sector and investors is that what is happening now in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, and the success we've had in Nigeria and Senegal with containing this virus must not be allowed to set Africa back. You, as private sector Africans and those who are friends of Africa, need to send the message out that we should not be so afraid of Ebola that we stigmatize the entire continent. I think it's only with your leadership as African investors that the rest of the world can see which way they should act. So I'm really urging you to be ambassadors to the continent, for the continent on this particular issue. Africa has made so much progress that there should be no reversal, no turning back. And I know that if we believe in ourselves and we put out the message, the trend we have can only be upwards. Now, that is not to say that we don't have problems or that the challenges are not there. As I said in a speech yesterday at the Atlantic Council, that's not the issue. The challenges are there, we must fully acknowledge them. Whether it be infrastructure, whether it be governance, corruption, whether it be our education systems, whether it be unemployment and inequality. We are not shying away from these challenges. But the point is that we are at a turning point now on the continent where we have the capacity, the political will, the confidence to tackle these problems. And I think that we as Africans must always take the lead. Because if we don't solve the problems for ourselves, nobody is going to come and solve it for us.
Eloquently spoke about the need for private sector,
Yes.
unit to get on board.
Yes.
What is the Africa investor putting on the table?
Listen, I think the most important thing is to have platforms that can communicate to influential groups, and that's what we have. So Africa Investor has a media business, and we have media interests. So we have a Africa Investor magazine, which is read now by over 2 million business and government officials each year. We're going to make that available in this fight, in this cause, to find the necessary cures for Ebola. And we're going to seek to continue to mobilize our colleagues from the private sector in that particular effort. And of course, on our investment side, we are very involved on the healthcare investment side as well, as one of the track for Africa Investor Capital. So we're going to continue to push that as well. I mean, this is a global issue, but the private sector, as the Honourable Minister made clear, has a very important role to play. And we look forward to, in the first instance, promoting and communicating that. And where there are investment opportunities to support, identify cures or learn more about that, we're certainly going to take a very hard look at that. Well, I mean, I think the way I'd look at it is, no matter whether it's Africa or whichever country in Africa or anywhere in the world, localize as best as you possibly can. So any international participation in local markets, you need a very good and strong local partner. Then I'm going to take the word strong away from this. You need a very good local partner, because you may not find a partner that meets all of your capacity expectations, your technical expectations, but you've got to become a part of the local economy and localize. And therefore, you've got to invest in your local partner relationships and take a medium to long-term view. We don't necessarily believe in the Africa Rising story because we think it's a distraction. We believe in, if an investor needs to see a project de-risked, de-risk that project, and that will be the rising story, as opposed to a narrative that is not linked to an investment opportunity that can be converted. And by the same token, these narratives need to come from the continent. And now we believe that it's very important that African governments have a message to own, as they say. You can't own your successes if you're not even allowed to own your own failures.
Okay.
Well, there have been some great meetings. I think today 90% of the investors that were here today have never heard from the IFC CEO. And the IFC CEO is a very big move for him to come and engage with us and really talk about his plans and his visions for Africa. And we want to continue to encourage that. We've got a great partner in the bank. It's just gone through a restructuring. Africa is going to be a major priority, and we really want to help them as much as we can. And we're going to look to them to help us and to help the regulators in Africa, their clients, the governments, create a more conducive environment for private sector development in Africa. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at things, but that issue on the agenda, private sector participation, is one that I think has been well and properly understood. So if you look at infrastructure in Africa and you look at infrastructure globally, there's an acronym, it's called PPI, which stands for Private Sector Participation in Infrastructure. Africa, only 1 in 10 projects that are infrastructure projects on the continent are led by an African developer. Elsewhere, again, it's in the 60% plus. I think now the bank have really begun to understand that concept, and we think there's a great model to say, let's develop that pipeline of African project developers and then find ways to encourage them to work with their international technical partners. And we think that's definitely, pardon the cliche, a real win-win.